A violent gust of wind nearly knocked Florence Oakley off her feet as she trudged along the muddy road leading away from the only home she had ever known. One hand clutched her small valise while the other instinctively wrapped around her still flat abdomen. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the light rain that had begun to fall, as the echo of her father's final words rang in her ears. "No daughter of mine will bring such shame upon this family. You are dead to us now." Florence was 20 years old, 3 months pregnant, and completely alone in the world. The year was 1876, and an unwed mother had few prospects and even fewer friends. The father of her child, a traveling salesman who had promised her the world, had vanished at the first mention of her condition. Her parents, pillars of their small Kansas community, had given her a single day to pack her belongings before casting her out. The road ahead stretched endlessly before her as the skies darkened. Florence had a little money saved from her job as a seamstress, but it wouldn't last long. She had heard of a stage-coach station some miles ahead where she might find transportation to a larger town, somewhere she could disappear and start anew. As the rain intensified, Florence's boots sank deeper into the mud with each step. The late October chill cut through her woolen coat, and she wondered how much farther she could go before seeking shelter. Ahead, through the gray curtain of rain, a small copse of trees offered minimal protection. She quickened her pace, desperate for even the slightest reprieve. Huddled beneath the sparse canopy, Florence allowed herself a moment to rest. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small, folded letter. The advertisement had been in last month's newspaper, a town called Cherry Creek in Colorado Territory, seeking women willing to work as teachers, seamstresses, and in various other respectable positions. It was her only hope, a destination that promised a fresh start far from the judgment and scorn she now faced. The distant rumble of wagon wheels stirred Florence from her thoughts. She peered through the rain to see a covered wagon approaching, pulled by 2 sturdy horses. The driver, hunched against the weather, hadn't noticed her yet. Florence hesitated only briefly before stepping out from beneath the trees and raising her hand in a desperate plea for assistance. The wagon slowed to a halt. The driver, a woman perhaps 10 years Florence's senior, regarded her with cautious eyes. "You'll catch your death out here," the woman called out. "Where are you headed?" "The stagecoach station," Florence replied, her voice nearly lost to the wind. "I'm trying to reach Cherry Creek in Colorado Territory." The woman studied her for a long moment, taking in Florence's bedraggled appearance and the small valise clutched in her trembling hand. Something in Florence's expression must have moved her because she nodded and gestured to the empty space beside her. "I'm headed to the station myself. Climb up." Florence didn't need to be told twice. With grateful hands, she accepted the woman's help and settled onto the wooden seat. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling her coat tighter around her body. "I'm Florence Oakley." "Martha Wilson," the woman replied, snapping the reins to set the horses in motion again. "What business takes you all the way to Cherry Creek?" "It's not exactly a journey for the faint of heart, especially this time of year." Florence swallowed hard. She had prepared a story, knowing she couldn't reveal the truth of her condition to strangers. "I'm a seamstress. I saw an advertisement seeking women with skills to help build the community there." Martha nodded, but said nothing more. They traveled in silence for several miles, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon and the steady fall of rain creating a melancholy backdrop to Florence's thoughts. She wondered what awaited her in Cherry Creek if she would find work, shelter, and perhaps even acceptance despite her condition. "The station's just ahead," Martha announced finally, breaking the silence. "You'll be able to catch the westbound stage tomorrow morning if you've got the fare." Florence felt a wave of relief wash over her. "I have enough for the journey," she assured Martha, though in truth her funds were perilously limited. The stage-coach station came into view, a sturdy log building with smoke curling from its chimney, promising warmth and shelter from the relentless rain. Several other wagons and horses were tethered outside, suggesting travelers had sought refuge from the worsening weather. Martha helped Florence down from the wagon and insisted on carrying her valise to the door. "Good luck to you, Miss Oakley," she said, her expression softening. "I hope you find what you're looking for in Cherry Creek." With those parting words, Florence was alone again. She pushed open the heavy wooden door to find a room crowded with travelers. A large fireplace dominated one wall, surrounded by men drying their rain-soaked clothing. A harried-looking station master stood behind a counter, arguing with a passenger about the next day's departure time. Florence made her way to the counter and waited patiently for the argument to conclude. When the station master finally turned his attention to her, his expression was one of weary resignation. "One passage to Denver," Florence requested, knowing she would need to find additional transportation from there to Cherry Creek. "That'll be $8, the station master informed her. "Stage leaves at first light. You can sleep in the common room with the other passengers, but it'll cost you extra for a private space." Florence handed over the money, wincing inwardly at the dwindling state of her funds. "The common room will be fine," she replied, though the thought of spending the night in close quarters with strangers, mostly men, filled her with trepidation. "Suit yourself," the station master said with a shrug, handing her a ticket. "There's stew in the pot if you're hungry." "Cost you another 50 cents. Florence nodded gratefully. She hadn't eaten since early morning, and the growing life within her demanded nourishment regardless of her financial concerns. She paid for a bowl of the thick, aromatic stew, and found a corner of the room away from most of the other travelers. As she ate, Florence observed her fellow passengers. Most were men traders, miners, and laborers seeking their fortunes in the Western Territories. A few women were scattered among them, their expressions guarded and their posture rigid. Florence wondered how many of them shared stories similar to her own. Night fell, and the station grew quieter. Travelers claimed spaces on the floor, using their packs as pillows and their coats as blankets. Florence found a spot near the fireplace where she could benefit from its warmth throughout the night. She removed her damp outer garments and arranged her valise as a makeshift pillow, all the while aware of curious glances from some of the male passengers. Sleep came fitfully. The hard floor, the occasional snores and mumblings of fellow travelers, and the persistent worry about her future kept Florence drifting in and out of consciousness. During one period of wakefulness, she placed her hand over her abdomen and whispered a silent promise to her unborn child. "We will find a place where we belong." Morning arrived with a flurry of activity. The station master bellowed for passengers to board, and Florence gathered her few possessions quickly. Outside, the stagecoach waited, an imposing vehicle drawn by 6 horses, their breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air. The rain had stopped, but the ground remained muddy and treacherous. Florence found herself seated between a portly merchant and an elderly woman traveling to Denver to live with her son. The close quarters inside the coach meant that conversation was inevitable, and Florence carefully crafted her responses to avoid revealing too much about her circumstances. The journey was arduous. The roads, softened by recent rainfall, caused the coach to lurch and sway alarmingly at times. Twice they had to stop to help push the vehicle from particularly muddy stretches. By midday, Florence's back ached, and nausea, a persistent companion since her pregnancy began, threatened to overwhelm her. During a brief stop to change horses, Florence stepped away from the other passengers and emptied her stomach behind a large boulder. The elderly woman, whose name was Mrs. Henderson, approached her with concern. "Are you unwell, dear?" she asked, offering Florence a handkerchief. "Just the motion of the coach," Florence lied, accepting the cloth gratefully. "I've never been a good traveler." Mrs. Henderson's knowing eyes suggested she wasn't fooled, but she merely patted Florence's arm sympathetically. "It will pass," she said, and Florence wasn't sure if the woman was referring to the nausea or to her situation more broadly. The journey continued for 3 more grueling days. They stopped at stations along the route to change horses, take meals, and occasionally sleep in accommodations similar to those at the first station. Each day, Florence's funds diminished further, and her anxiety grew. By the time they reached Denver, she had only enough money for perhaps a week's lodging and food, with little left for the final leg of her journey to Cherry Creek. Denver was overwhelming after the small Kansas town where Florence had spent her entire life. The city bustled with activity, construction everywhere, crowds of people hurrying along wooden sidewalks, wagons and horses creating a cacophony of noise. Florence stood on the street outside the stage-coach office, clutching her valise and feeling utterly lost. "You have lodgings, dear," Mrs. Henderson asked, appearing at Florence's side. "My son's home is not far, and we could perhaps direct you to a respectable boarding house." Florence hesitated. "I need to find transportation to Cherry Creek," she admitted. "I'm not staying in Denver." Mrs. Henderson frowned. "Cherry Creek. That's a small mining town about 40 miles south. Not an easy journey for a young woman alone." Before Florence could respond, a deep voice joined their conversation. "Excuse me, ladies. Did I hear someone mention Cherry Creek?" Florence turned to find a tall man in his early 30s standing nearby. He wore the practical clothing of a working man: sturdy trousers, a flannel shirt, and a well-worn leather vest. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing sandy brown hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. "Yes," Florence replied cautiously. "I'm trying to find passage there." The man nodded. "Brayden Zeller," he introduced himself, extending a calloused hand. "I run supplies between Denver and Cherry Creek regular. Heading back tomorrow morning if you're looking for transport." Florence glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who subtly nodded her approval after studying the man. "How much would you charge for passage?" Florence asked, already calculating whether she could afford it. "Normally charge $3, Brayden replied, his blue eyes assessing her with unexpected kindness. "But I could use help with the inventory along the way. Make it $2 if you're willing to lend a hand." The offer was generous, and Florence felt a surge of relief. "Thank you, Mr. Zeller, I accept your offer. Call me Brayden," he insisted with an easy smile. "I'll be leaving from Macaulay's Mercantile at sunrise. You know where that is?" When Florence shook her head, Mrs. Henderson intervened. "My son can show you to a decent boarding house near there. You can meet this gentleman in the morning." The arrangements were made quickly. Mrs. Henderson's son, a respectable banker, escorted Florence to a modest boarding house run by a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Clarkson. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and chair being the only furnishings. At 50 cents for the night, it was more than Florence had hoped to find. Alone in her room that evening, Florence carefully counted her remaining money. After paying for her night's lodging and setting aside the $2 for tomorrow's journey, she had barely $4 to her name. The realization brought a fresh wave of anxiety. How would she establish herself in Cherry Creek? How would she provide for her child? Sleep eluded her for much of the night as these questions circled in her mind. When she did finally drift off, her dreams were filled with images of her parents' disapproving faces and the unknown challenges that lay ahead. Morning came too quickly. Florence dressed in her best traveling dress, a simple blue cotton garment that still concealed her condition, and gathered her few possessions. She had skipped dinner the previous night to save money, and her stomach protested the lack of nourishment. Nevertheless, she forced herself to ignore the hunger as she made her way to Macaulay's Mercantile. Brayden Zeller was already there when she arrived, loading supplies onto a sturdy wagon. He greeted her with a nod and continued his work, seemingly unbothered by her early arrival. "Ever made this journey before?" he asked as he secured a crate of canned goods. "No," Florence admitted. "I've never been west of Kansas until now." Brayden paused in his work, giving her a more thorough appraisal. "What brings you all the way to Cherry Creek?" Not many women make that journey voluntarily. Florence had rehearsed her story countless times. "I'm a seamstress. There was an advertisement seeking women with practical skills to help establish the community." Brayden nodded slowly. "Town's growing fast. Lot of men working the mines and building businesses, not many women or families yet. Your skills will be welcome." He gestured to the wagon. "We're nearly ready. If you want to get settled, there's a space for you up front." Florence climbed onto the wagon seat, placing her valise at her feet. The morning was cool but clear, promising a pleasant day for travel. As Brayden finished securing the last of his cargo and joined her on the seat, she couldn't help but notice his methodical efficiency and the strength evident in his movements. "It's about a day and a half to Cherry Creek if the weather holds," he informed her as he took up the reins. "We'll camp tonight and reach town by tomorrow afternoon." The wagon lurched forward, and Florence gripped the wooden seat to steady herself. As they left Denver behind, the landscape opened up before them, rolling hills giving way to more dramatic terrain as they approached the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Despite her circumstances, Florence couldn't help but be awed by the majestic scenery. "It's beautiful," she murmured, more to herself than to her companion. "That it is," Brayden agreed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Different kind of beauty than what you'd find back east, but it gets under your skin. Been out here 8 years now, can't imagine going back." "What brought you west?" Florence asked, grateful for the distraction of conversation. Brayden was silent for a moment, as if weighing how much to share. "War ended and home didn't feel like home anymore," he said finally. "Too many ghosts. Came west looking for something new, I suppose. Found work, then found purpose. Now I supply most of the businesses in Cherry Creek, bring mail and goods from Denver." "You fought in the war?" Florence asked, studying his profile. He would have been very young when the Civil War ended in 1865, perhaps just 17 or 18. "Last year of it," he confirmed, his expression growing distant. "Lost my father and older brother before I ever enlisted. Mother passed while I was away, came home to nothing worth staying for." Florence felt a pang of sympathy. Despite her current circumstances, she had at least known the security of a loving family until recently. "I'm sorry for your losses," she said softly. Brayden glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "Life takes unexpected turns," he observed. "Seems like you might know something about that yourself." Florence looked away, afraid her eyes might reveal too much. "Yes," she agreed simply. They traveled in comfortable silence for a time, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves creating a soothing backdrop. Around midday, Brayden pulled the wagon to a stop beside a small stream. "Good spot to rest the horses and have some food," he announced, setting the brake and jumping down from the seat. He reached up to offer Florence assistance, his strong hands easily supporting her weight as she descended. From the back of the wagon, Brayden produced a loaf of bread, some cheese, and dried fruit. "Not fancy, but it'll keep us going," he said, offering Florence a share. The simple meal was the most delicious thing Florence had tasted in days. She ate slowly, savoring each bite and trying to ignore the nagging voice in her head that reminded her how quickly her meager funds would disappear once she reached Cherry Creek. "You mentioned helping with inventory," she said as they finished eating. "How can I assist?" Brayden seemed pleased by her initiative. "I've got a ledger with everything we're carrying. Need to check it against what's loaded to make sure the mercantile gave us everything ordered. Gets tedious doing it alone." For the next hour, they worked together, Brayden calling out items from his list, while Florence located them among the cargo, confirming quantities and conditions. The task was indeed tedious, but Florence welcomed the opportunity to be useful and to earn the reduction in her passage fee. As they prepared to continue their journey, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. Brayden eyed them with concern. "Might be in for some weather," he observed. "We should try to make it to Wilson's Creek before nightfall. There's an old line shack there where we can take shelter if needed." The wagon rolled on, now with more urgency as the clouds continued to build. Florence found herself watching Brayden's capable hands as he handled the reins, noting the quiet confidence with which he managed the team. He was unlike any man she had ever known, direct in his speech, competent in his actions, and possessing a kind of unassuming integrity that she found oddly comforting. "Tell me about Cherry Creek," she requested as the afternoon wore on. "What should I expect?" Brayden considered the question. "It's growing fast. Started as a mining camp 5 years ago, but there's good land for ranching too. About 300 people now, mostly men. Got a general store, a hotel, couple of saloons. New church went up last year, school's just getting established. And the women there," Florence pressed. "You mentioned there aren't many. Mostly wives who came with their husbands, a few widows running boarding houses, handful of women working in the saloons," Brayden replied. "Town's desperate for a seamstress, though. Nearest one is in Pine Hollow, 20 miles north." This information brought Florence some relief. If her skills were truly needed, perhaps establishing herself wouldn't be as difficult as she feared. The first fat raindrops began to fall as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Brayden urged the horses to a quicker pace, his expression growing more concerned as the rainfall intensified. By the time they reached Wilson's Creek, rain was falling in sheets, and Florence was drenched despite the protection of her coat. The line shack was little more than a crude cabin nestled among a stand of pine trees near the creek. Brayden drove the wagon as close as possible, then jumped down to unhitch the horses. "Get inside," he called to Florence over the howling wind. "Door shouldn't be locked." Florence grabbed her valise and made a dash for the cabin. The door opened with a creak, revealing a dusty interior lit only by what little daylight filtered through a single small window. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot completing the sparse furnishings. By the time Brayden joined her, having seen to the horses, Florence had found a lantern and matches stored on a shelf. The warm glow of the lamp pushed back the gathering darkness, creating a small circle of light in the otherwise gloomy space. "Not exactly the Palmer house," Brayden commented wryly, removing his dripping hat and coat. "But it'll keep us dry for the night. I'll get a fire going." Florence stood awkwardly by the table, suddenly very aware of the impropriety of their situation. She was alone in a remote cabin with a man she barely knew, miles from civilization. In other circumstances, such a situation would be scandalous beyond measure. Given her current condition, however, her reputation was already in tatters. Brayden seemed oblivious to her discomfort as he efficiently built a fire in the fireplace. Soon, flames were crackling merrily, casting warm light and much-needed heat into the small space. "You should get out of those wet clothes," he advised matter-of-factly, turning his attention to a cupboard where he found a dented coffee pot and tin cups. "I'll make some coffee and give you privacy." Florence blushed at his directness, but couldn't argue with his practical suggestion. Her dress was indeed soaked through, and she risked illness if she remained in the wet garments. "Thank you," she murmured, waiting until Brayden had stepped outside before quickly changing into her only other dress, a simple brown cotton garment that was thankfully still dry inside her valise. When Brayden returned, his arms full of supplies from the wagon, he nodded approvingly at her dry attire. "Found some beans and salt pork," he announced. "Not much of a cook, but it'll be hot at least." They worked together in the small space, Brayden preparing the simple meal while Florence arranged their wet garments near the fire to dry. The domestic scene felt oddly natural, despite the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. As they sat by the fire eating their rudimentary supper, the storm raged outside. Rain lashed against the single window, and wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Florence couldn't help but shiver, not entirely from cold. "Storms got you worried?" Brayden asked, noticing her reaction. "A little," she admitted. "I've never traveled like this before." Brayden's expression was reassuring. "Made this journey hundreds of times. Storm might slow us down, but we'll reach Cherry Creek safe enough." "It's not just the journey," Florence confessed, surprising herself with her candor. "It's what comes after. I know nothing about Cherry Creek except what you've told me. I have no arrangements for lodging, no guarantee of work." She trailed off, unwilling to reveal the true extent of her anxiety that she was pregnant, nearly penniless and entirely alone in the world. Brayden studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Mrs. Sullivan runs a decent boarding house," he said finally. "Reasonable rates for working women. As for employment, McPherson at the general store was just saying last week how badly the town needs a seamstress. His wife's been trying to keep up with mending and alterations, but she's got her hands full with 4 young ones." The information should have been reassuring, but Florence couldn't shake her sense of dread. "And if there's no work, no place for me." "Then we'll figure something else out," Brayden replied simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for him to take responsibility for her welfare. Florence looked at him in surprise. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Brayden shrugged, his gaze returning to the fire. "Been on my own long enough to know how it feels to have nowhere to turn. Besides, Cherry Creek needs good people with useful skills. Town still finding its character could become a decent place for families, or it could go the other way. Each new arrival tips the balance one way or the other." His words gave Florence pause. She had been so focused on her own desperate situation that she hadn't considered how she might contribute to a community still in its formative stages. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the encouragement and the practical advice." Brayden nodded, seeming slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude. He rose and added another log to the fire before gesturing to the cot. "You should take that. I'll make do on the floor." Florence began to protest, but Brayden held up a hand to stop her. "I've slept on worse," he assured her. "Been caught out in the open during blizzards before. This is luxury by comparison." Too exhausted to argue, Florence accepted his gallantry. She arranged her valise as a pillow and used her shawl as a blanket, stretching out on the narrow cot while Brayden made himself a pallet on the floor near the fire. "Good night, Miss Oakley," he said, tipping his hat in an oddly formal gesture before settling down. "Good night, Mr. Zeller," she replied. finding comfort in the simple exchange. Despite her exhaustion, sleep once again proved elusive. Florence lay awake, listening to the storm outside and the occasional crackling of the fire. Across the small room, Brayden's breathing had already settled into the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. In the flickering firelight, Florence studied his features. His face, relaxed in sleep, looked younger somehow, the lines of worry and responsibility temporarily smoothed away. She wondered about his life, about the experiences that had shaped him into the man who would offer assistance to a stranger without hesitation. Eventually, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the surprisingly comforting presence of her traveling companion, Florence drifted into a dreamless sleep. She awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of rain still pattering against the roof, though with less intensity than the previous evening. Brayden was already up, tending the fire and heating water in the dented coffee pot. "Morning," he greeted her, noticing she was awake. "Storm's letting up. Should be able to get back on the road after breakfast." Florence sat up, suddenly conscious of her rumpled appearance and the intimacy of sharing such close quarters. She smoothed her hair as best she could without a proper mirror and arranged her shawl more modestly around her shoulders. "Is there somewhere I might?" She began awkwardly, unsure how to politely inquire about necessary facilities. "Outhouse is around back," Brayden informed her, understanding her unspoken question. "Not much to look at, but it serves its purpose." Breakfast consisted of coffee and the last of the bread and cheese from the previous day. As they ate, Brayden outlined his plan for the remainder of their journey. "Road'll be muddy, but passable," he explained. "We should reach Cherry Creek by mid-afternoon if we make good time. I'll take you straight to Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house so you can get settled." Florence nodded gratefully. "And the general store you mentioned, where Mr. McPherson might need a seamstress." "Just down the street from Mrs. Sullivan's," Brayden assured her. "I'll introduce you if you'd like." "That would be very kind," Florence replied, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. How long could she conceal her condition once she settled in Cherry Creek? What would happen when her pregnancy became evident? They departed the line shack within the hour, leaving it as they had found it for the next travelers who might need emergency shelter. The rain had indeed slackened to a gentle drizzle, and patches of blue sky were visible through breaks in the clouds. The journey was slower than the previous day, with the wagon wheels occasionally sinking into muddy patches that required Brayden's strength and patience to navigate. Florence admired his calm determination as he coaxed the horses through particularly difficult stretches, never once losing his temper or showing frustration. As they traveled, the landscape grew more dramatic. The rolling foothills gave way to steeper terrain, with stands of pine trees and dramatic rock formations punctuating the vista. In the distance, snow-capped mountains created a majestic backdrop against the clearing sky. "Just beyond those hills is Cherry Creek," Brayden announced as the afternoon wore on. He pointed to a range of low mountains ahead. "Town sits in a valley with the creek running through it. Good water, sheltered location. Smart place to build a settlement." Florence felt her heart rate increase as they drew closer to their destination. This remote town would be her home now, the place where her child would be born, where she would attempt to rebuild her life from the shambles it had become. As they crested the final hill, Cherry Creek came into view below them. The town was larger than Florence had expected, several streets of wooden buildings stretching along both sides of a fast-flowing creek. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, and even from this distance she could see people moving about their business. On the outskirts she noticed fenced properties with livestock, the ranches Brayden had mentioned. "What do you think?" Brayden asked, noting her expression of surprise. "It's more established than I imagined," Florence admitted. From your description, I expected something more primitive. Brayden chuckled. Town's growing faster than I can keep up with. New buildings going up every month. Still rough around the edges, but it's coming along. As they descended into the valley and approached the town proper, Florence observed the details more closely. The main street was lined with businesses, a general store with McPherson's Mercantile painted on its facade, a hotel grandly named the Cherry Creek Palace, though it was merely a two-story wooden structure, and several saloons with colorful names like the Lucky Strike and the Prospector's Dream. A small white church stood at one end of town, while newer construction was evident on the outskirts. People stopped to watch as Brayden's wagon rolled down the main street. Men tipped their hats and several called out greetings. Florence felt uncomfortably conspicuous as curious eyes assessed her, clearly a newcomer and a woman, a rare enough combination to warrant attention. Brayden guided the wagon to a two-story building with a sign identifying it as Sullivan's boarding house. He set the brake and jumped down, then came around to help Florence descend. "Wait here," he instructed. "I'll see if Mrs. Sullivan has a room available." Florence stood beside the wagon, acutely aware of the stares from passers-by. A group of miners, their clothes and faces still bearing the grime of their labor, paused in their conversation to openly appraise her. A woman across the street, dressed in the practical garments of a frontier wife, studied her with equal interest before hurrying into the general store. Brayden returned moments later, accompanied by a stout woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her expression was stern but not unkind as she evaluated Florence. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Miss Florence Oakley," Brayden introduced them. "Miss Oakley is a seamstress looking to establish herself in Cherry Creek." "A seamstress, is it?" Mrs. Sullivan's face brightened noticeably. "Well, that's a welcome skill indeed. Been sending my mending all the way to Pine Hollow since Mrs. Johnson passed last winter." "Miss Oakley needs lodging," Brayden continued. "I mentioned you run the most respectable boarding house in town." Mrs. Sullivan preened slightly at the compliment. "Only boarding house that doesn't accept gentlemen callers at all hours, that's certain," she agreed. "I've a small room available, $2 a week including breakfast and supper. No gentlemen visitors in the rooms, curfew at 9 o'clock, and I expect all my lodgers to attend church on Sundays." The price was steep given Florence's limited funds, but she had no alternative. "That would be suitable, thank you," she replied, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "Very good," Mrs. Sullivan nodded approvingly. "Mr. Zeller, if you'd bring the young lady's belongings inside, I'll show her to her room." Brayden retrieved Florence's valise from the wagon and followed as Mrs. Sullivan led them into the boarding house. The interior was meticulously clean, with simple but well-maintained furnishings. A parlor to the right of the entrance held several chairs and a small piano, while straight ahead a dining room was set with a long table that could accommodate at least a dozen people. "6 ladies currently in residence, Mrs. Sullivan informed Florence as they climbed the stairs to the second floor. "All respectable women, 2 teachers, a nurse, and 3 widows. You'll meet them at supper." The room was at the end of a narrow hallway. Mrs. Sullivan produced a key and unlocked the door to reveal a space barely large enough for a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a washstand. A single window overlooked the back of the property, where Florence could see a vegetable garden and clotheslines. "Not spacious, but clean and private," Mrs. Sullivan stated. "Bathing room at the end of the hall, used on a schedule posted on the door. Breakfast at 6:30, supper at 6. You're responsible for your own midday meal." Brayden set Florence's valise on the floor beside the bed. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said. "If you're amenable, I could take you to meet Mr. McPherson tomorrow morning. He opens the store at 8. "That would be very helpful," Florence replied, suddenly reluctant to see him go. In the span of their brief acquaintance, Brayden had become her only friend and ally in this unfamiliar place. "First week's rent is due in advance," Mrs. Sullivan interjected, her practical nature reasserting itself. Florence opened her valise and withdrew her carefully wrapped bundle of money. With trembling fingers, she counted out $2 and handed them to her new landlady. The transaction left her with exactly $2 to her name, enough for one more week's lodging or perhaps a few supplies to begin her work as a seamstress, but not both. Mrs. Sullivan pocketed the money with a satisfied nod. "Supper's at 6 sharp," she reminded them before departing, leaving Florence and Brayden alone in the small room. An awkward silence fell between them. Brayden shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hat in his hands. "Thank you," Florence said finally, "for everything. I don't know what I would have done without your assistance." Brayden's expression softened. "Glad to help," he replied simply. "Cherry Creek needs good people. You'll do well here, I think." With that, he placed his hat back on his head and turned to go. At the doorway, he paused. "I'll come by at 7:45 tomorrow," he promised. "Rest well, Miss Oakley." After he left, Florence sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. She was in a strange town, with almost no money, a baby on the way, and no guarantee of employment or acceptance. The facade of courage she had maintained throughout the journey crumbled, and she buried her face in her hands as tears came. She allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of despair before straightening her shoulders and wiping her eyes. Self-pity would not secure her future or provide for her child. She needed to be practical, resourceful, and determined. Florence unpacked her few possessions, arranging them carefully in the dresser drawers. From the bottom of her valise, she withdrew her most valuable assets: her sewing scissors, needles, thimbles, and measuring tape. These tools of her trade represented her only hope for independence. At precisely 6 o'clock, a bell rang downstairs, signaling supper. Florence washed her face, smoothed her dress, and prepared to meet her fellow boarders. Whatever judgments they might make about a young, single woman arriving unaccompanied in a frontier town, she would face them with dignity. The dining room held 7 women, including Mrs. Sullivan, when Florence entered. Conversation stopped as all eyes turned to evaluate the newcomer. Mrs. Sullivan made brief introductions: the 2 teachers, Miss Porter and Miss Halloway, the nurse, Mrs. Chambers, and the 3 widows, Mrs. Billings, Mrs. Garvey, and Mrs. Wright. Florence committed each name to memory, aware that these women could become either allies or obstacles in her new life. "Miss Oakley is a seamstress," Mrs. Sullivan announced as Florence took the empty seat at the table. "She's come all the way from Kansas to establish herself here in Cherry Creek." The announcement caused a ripple of interest around the table. Mrs. Billings, a plump woman in her 40s, clasped her hands in apparent delight. "A seamstress! What a blessing! I've been waiting months to have my Sunday dress altered. And I need new curtains for the schoolroom," added Miss Porter, the younger of the 2 teachers. "The sun makes it unbearably hot in the afternoons." Florence felt a cautious optimism as the women continued to enumerate various sewing projects they had postponed due to the lack of a skilled seamstress. Perhaps Brayden had been right about the town's need for her skills. Supper was simple but hearty: beef stew, corn bread, and stewed apples. Florence ate gratefully, aware that regular meals might become a luxury if she couldn't secure steady work quickly. Throughout the meal, she answered questions about her journey and her background, carefully omitting any mention of her pregnancy or the circumstances that had led to her departure from Kansas. After the meal, Florence pleaded fatigue from her journey and retired to her room. She sat by the window watching darkness fall over Cherry Creek, the lights from the saloons and a few homes creating a constellation of warmth in the gathering night. In the distance, she could hear piano music and occasional bursts of laughter from one of the establishments on the main street. Despite her exhaustion, Florence took the time to prepare for her meeting with Mr. McPherson. She laid out her best dress, the blue one she had worn upon arrival, now dry and brushed clean. She organized her sewing implements and considered what she might say to convince the storekeeper of her skills and reliability. Sleep came more easily than she expected. The physical and emotional toll of the past few days finally overwhelming her anxiety about the future. Her last conscious thought was of Brayden Zeller's reassuring presence and his promise to help her find her place in Cherry Creek. Morning arrived with the sound of movement in the boarding house doors opening and closing, water being poured, and the clatter of dishes from downstairs. Florence rose and dressed carefully, arranging her hair in a simple but neat style and pinching her cheeks to bring some color to her pale face. Breakfast was a quiet affair, with most of the boarders eating quickly before departing for their various occupations. Florence managed to consume some porridge and bread, despite the nervousness that had returned with the new day. Brayden arrived precisely at 7:45, his wagon parked outside the boarding house. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His shirt was crisp, his hair neatly combed, and his boots polished. "Good morning, Miss Oakley," he greeted her with a tip of his hat. "Ready to meet Mr. McPherson?" Florence nodded, clutching a small bundle containing samples of her needlework that she had brought from Kansas. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, unable to entirely mask her anxiety. They walked side by side down the main street toward McPherson's Mercantile. Florence was again conscious of curious glances from the townspeople, though today there seemed to be as much interest in her companion as in herself. "People are staring," she murmured to Brayden. He chuckled softly. "Not used to seeing me in the company of a lady," he explained. "Especially one as refined as yourself." The compliment brought a blush to Florence's cheeks, but she had no opportunity to respond as they had reached the Mercantile. The store was already open, with several customers examining goods displayed on shelves and in barrels throughout the spacious interior. Behind the counter stood a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose and a pencil tucked behind his ear. He looked up as they entered, his face breaking into a smile of recognition. "Zeller, didn't expect to see you until next week's delivery. What brings you by so early?" Brayden guided Florence forward with a light touch at her elbow. "Robert, this is Miss Florence Oakley. She's new to Cherry Creek and is looking for work as a seamstress. Miss Oakley, this is Robert McPherson, owner of the finest mercantile between Denver and Santa Fe." McPherson removed his spectacles and studied Florence with evident interest. "A seamstress, you say? Well now, that's providential timing. My wife's been overwhelmed with mending and alterations since Mrs. Johnson passed, not to mention the demands of the miners and ranchers who need work done." "I brought samples of my work," Florence offered, unwrapping her bundle to reveal delicate embroidery, precise darning, and a small quilt square with intricate piecing. McPherson examined the samples with an expert eye, nodding approvingly. "Fine work, Miss Oakley, very fine indeed. My wife would be most grateful for the assistance." He paused, considering. "I can't offer a regular salary, mind you, but we could provide space in the back room for you to meet with customers and do your work. You'd collect your own fees, with 20% going to the store for the use of the space and referrals. It wasn't an ideal arrangement, but it would allow Florence to begin establishing herself without any initial investment. "That seems fair," she agreed. "When might I start?" "Today, if you're willing," McPherson replied eagerly. "My wife's in the back room now, drowning in mending. Let me introduce you." Mrs. McPherson was a harried-looking woman with 4 young children orbiting around her like planets around the sun. She was attempting to mend a pair of trousers while simultaneously monitoring her brood and sorting a pile of fabrics. Her relief at Florence's introduction was palpable. "A seamstress, thank the Lord," she exclaimed, setting aside her work. "I've more mending than I can manage, and Mrs. Wilson from the ranch outside town needs new dresses for her twin girls, and at least 3 minors came in last week needing their work clothes repaired." Florence felt a surge of confidence as she surveyed the chaotic workroom. Here was a need she could fill, a way to support herself and her unborn child. "I can begin immediately," she assured Mrs. McPherson. "If you'll show me what's most urgent, I'll get started right away." The arrangement was quickly finalized. Florence would work in the back room of the mercantile 6 days a week, taking Sundays off for church as was the custom in town. She would set her own hours and fees, with the McPhersons handling the initial customer contacts and taking their percentage. As Brayden prepared to leave, he paused at the door of the workroom. "Seems like you're in good hands," he observed, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "I make deliveries to Denver every 2 weeks, but I'm usually around town in between, if you need anything." "Thank you," Florence said sincerely. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." Brayden shook his head. "No repayment necessary, just glad to see things working out." He hesitated, then added, "Perhaps I could call on you sometime, properly, I mean, at the boarding house." The unexpected invitation caught Florence off guard. Under normal circumstances, she might have welcomed the attention of a man like Brayden Zeller, honest, hardworking, and kind. But her pregnancy complicated matters immeasurably. How could she encourage his interest when her condition would soon become apparent? "That would be nice," she heard herself say, despite her reservations. "Mrs. Sullivan allows callers in the parlor on Saturday evenings and Sunday afternoons." Brayden's smile was warm. "Saturday evening, then," he confirmed before touching the brim of his hat in farewell and departing. Florence turned her attention to the work at hand, pushing aside thoughts of her growing attraction to the freight driver and the complications it presented. Mrs. McPherson was already explaining the most urgent projects and introducing her to the workspace. By midday, Florence had completed repairs on 3 shirts, a pair of trousers, and a child's dress. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, finding comfort in the familiar tasks. Each completed project represented coins in her pocket, security for herself and her child. Word of the new seamstress spread quickly through Cherry Creek. Throughout the afternoon, women stopped by the mercantile to introduce themselves and discuss potential projects. By closing time, Florence had a list of commissions that would keep her busy for weeks. As she prepared to return to the boarding house for supper, Mr. McPherson approached with a small cloth bag. "Your share of today's earnings," he explained, handing it to her. "Less our 20%, of course." Florence was astonished to find nearly $3 in the bag, more than she had earned in a week of sewing back in Kansas. "This is very generous," she murmured. McPherson shrugged. "Charge what the work is worth," he advised. "Folks here have money from the mines and ranches, and they're willing to pay for quality work. Don't undersell yourself." The advice was sound, and Florence tucked it away along with her earnings. As she walked back to the boarding house, her step was lighter than it had been in months. She had found work, earned money, and begun to establish herself in her new community. That night at supper, The other boarders treated her with increased respect as news of her skill had already circulated. Mrs. Sullivan herself requested Florence's assistance with new curtains for the parlor, offering to deduct the cost from her weekly rent. The days fell into a pattern. Florence rose early, took breakfast with the other boarders, and was at the mercantile by 8 each morning. She worked steadily throughout the day, breaking only for a simple midday meal. Her clientele grew rapidly, and by the end of her first week, she had earned enough to pay for another 2 weeks' lodging with money to spare. On Saturday evening, true to his word, Brayden called at the boarding house. He arrived at 7 o'clock, wearing a clean shirt and carrying a small bunch of wildflowers. Mrs. Sullivan showed him into the parlor where Florence waited, her heart beating unexpectedly fast at the sight of him. "These are for you," he said, presenting the flowers with an almost boyish awkwardness. "Found them on the hillside outside town." "They're beautiful," Florence replied, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan provided a small vase for the flowers and reminded them that the parlor closed to visitors at 9 before discreetly withdrawing. Other boarders occasionally passed through the room, but for the most part, Florence and Brayden had privacy for their conversation. "I hear you've been busy," Brayden commented. "McPherson says he hasn't seen the store so full of women since he put calico on sale last Christmas." Florence smiled at the observation. "There seems to be no shortage of work," she agreed. "I've had to start a waiting list for new commissions." They talked easily about the town, its inhabitants, and the changes Brayden had seen during his 8 years in the territory. Florence found herself laughing at his stories about local characters and the early days of Cherry Creek. "It was just a handful of tents and crude cabins when I first came through," he told her. "Hard to believe how it's grown." "Do you live in town?" Florence asked, realizing she knew very little about his personal circumstances. Brayden shook his head. "Got a small homestead about 3 miles outside town," he explained. "Nothing fancy cabin, barn, corral for the horses. Been working the land between freight runs, trying to build something that might last." The image of Brayden working his own land, building something permanent, stirred an unexpected longing in Florence. How different might her life have been if the father of her child had been a man of similar character and responsibility? As if reading her thoughts, Brayden asked gently, "You haven't spoken much about your life before coming to Cherry Creek. What brought you all the way from Kansas?" Florence looked down at her hands, considering how much to reveal. The complete truth was impossible, but perhaps a version of it. "My parents died recently," she said, the lie bitter on her tongue despite its necessity. "There was nothing to keep me in Kansas, and I saw the advertisement seeking women with practical skills for Cherry Creek. It seemed like an opportunity for a fresh start." Brayden's expression was sympathetic. "I'm sorry about your parents," he said sincerely. "Losing family is never easy, no matter the circumstances." The evening passed too quickly. At 9 o'clock precisely, Mrs. Sullivan appeared to announce that visiting hours were concluded. Brayden rose reluctantly. "Might I call on you again tomorrow afternoon?" he asked. "After church? Perhaps we could walk by the creek if the weather's fine." Florence knew she should discourage his attentions. In a few more weeks, her condition would become noticeable, and any romantic interest he had would surely evaporate in the face of scandal. Yet she found herself unable to refuse the simple pleasure of his company. "I would like that," she replied, accepting her own weakness in the matter. Sunday brought clear skies and mild temperatures. Florence attended church with the other boarders, acutely conscious of Brayden's presence several pews behind her. The service was simple but heartfelt. led by a young minister whose sermon focused on the importance of community and acceptance, themes that resonated deeply with Florence in her current circumstances. After the service, Florence was introduced to more townspeople, all of whom expressed interest in her services as a seamstress. She noted the looks exchanged between some of the older women as they observed Brayden waiting patiently to speak with her, and she felt a flush of embarrassment at being the subject of such obvious speculation. Their walk took them along the creek that gave the town its name. The water flowed clear and swift, bordered by cottonwood trees and willows that provided welcome shade. They followed a well-worn path away from town, talking easily about inconsequential matters until the houses were no longer visible behind them. "This is my favorite spot," Brayden said as they reached a small clearing beside the creek. A fallen log provided a natural bench overlooking the water. "Peaceful. Reminds me that there's more to life than deliveries and inventories." They sat side by side, watching the water flow past and listening to birdsong from the trees above. The moment felt strangely intimate despite its innocence. "You ever get lonely?" Florence asked suddenly. "Living alone, I mean." Brayden considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted. "More so lately. For years, the work was enough, building the freight business, improving the homestead. But lately—" He trailed off, seeming unsure how to continue. "Lately," Florence prompted gently. "Lately, I've been thinking there should be more," he said finally. "Seeing the families settling here, watching the town grow beyond just miners and drifters, makes a man wonder what he's building for, if not to share it someday." The honesty of his response touched Florence deeply. Here was a man who had faced hardship and solitude, yet maintained hope for connection and meaning. How different from the smooth-talking salesman who had courted her with empty promises before vanishing at the first sign of responsibility. "What about you?" Brayden asked, turning the question back to her. "You see yourself settling permanently in Cherry Creek, or is this just a stopping place on your journey?" The question forced Florence to consider her future in concrete terms. Until now, she had been focused solely on survival, finding work, securing lodging, preparing for her child's arrival. The idea of Cherry Creek as a permanent home, a place to build a life, had not fully formed in her mind. "I hadn't thought beyond the immediate future," she confessed. "But I like it here. The people have been kind, the work is plentiful. I could see myself staying under the right circumstances." Brayden seemed pleased by her answer. They continued talking as the afternoon wore on, sharing stories from their childhoods and discussing their hopes for the future, though Florence carefully edited her own to exclude the child growing within her. When it was time to return to town, Brayden helped her to her feet, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. The contact sent an unexpected flutter through Florence's chest. "May I call on you again next Saturday?" he asked as they walked back toward the boarding house. Florence knew she should refuse. By next Saturday, her condition might be noticeable to an observant eye. The longer she allowed this connection to develop, the more painful its inevitable end would be for both of them. Yet once again, she found herself unable to deny the comfort of his presence. "Yes," she agreed, knowing it was selfish but unable to resist the temporary reprieve from her isolation. The following weeks brought increasing success in Florence's business and growing anxiety about her personal situation. Her client list expanded beyond the capacity of the small workroom at the Mercantile, and Mr. McPherson suggested she might consider taking a small storefront of her own when one became available. Meanwhile, her waistline expanded in ways that became increasingly difficult to conceal. She let out her dresses discreetly, but soon even these adjustments would be insufficient. By her calculation, She was nearly 5 months pregnant, past the halfway point of her confinement. Brayden continued to call on her each Saturday evening and Sunday afternoon. Their conversations deepened, touching on more personal topics and revealing a growing affection that frightened Florence even as it comforted her. He spoke of his plans for expanding his homestead, of building a larger house someday, and she couldn't help but hear the unspoken invitation in his words. The situation came to a crisis on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. Florence was working on a wedding dress for a young woman engaged to one of the more prosperous ranchers outside town, when she felt a flutter of movement within her womb, the first definitive sign of life from her child. The sensation was so surprising that she gasped aloud, her hand flying to her abdomen. Mrs. McPherson, who had entered the workroom with a delivery of new fabrics, noticed the gesture and Florence's expression. Her eyes narrowed slightly as they traveled from Florence's face to her midsection and back again. No words were exchanged, but Florence knew her secret had been discovered. That evening, Mrs. Sullivan was waiting when Florence returned to the boarding house. Her expression was grave as she asked Florence to join her in her private sitting room, a request that had never been made before. "Miss Oakley," the older woman began once they were seated, "I received a visit from Mrs. McPherson this afternoon." Florence's heart sank. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she had hoped for more time to establish herself, to save more money, to prepare for the ostracism that would surely follow the revelation of her condition. "I see," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Mrs. Sullivan's expression was difficult to read, not exactly condemnation, but certainly not acceptance. "My establishment has a reputation to maintain," she said firmly. "I cannot have a woman in your condition residing here. It would reflect poorly on the other boarders." Florence nodded, having expected nothing less. "How long do I have to find alternative arrangements?" "Until the end of the week," Mrs. Sullivan replied, her tone softening slightly. "I've already collected your rent through Saturday, so it's only fair you have until then. 3 days. 3 days to find new lodging in a town where options for single women were extremely limited, especially one in her condition." Florence felt panic rising in her chest, but forced it down. Panic would not help her situation. "Thank you for the notice," she said with as much dignity as she could muster. "I will make arrangements immediately." That night, Florence lay awake in her narrow bed, considering her options. She had saved nearly $30 from her earnings, a substantial sum, but not enough to secure housing and prepare for the baby's arrival. She could perhaps rent a room above one of the saloons, but such accommodations would destroy what remained of her reputation and potentially harm her business. The possibility of leaving Cherry Creek crossed her mind, but where would she go? Denver was too expensive, and smaller settlements would likely be even less accepting of her situation. Besides, she had built something here, a growing business, a place in the community, however tenuous. Morning brought no clarity. Florence went to work as usual, though the strain of her situation must have shown on her face because customers remarked on her pallor and asked if she was unwell. By midday, Florence felt the walls closing in around her. She needed air, space to think. She stepped outside the mercantile, intending only to take a brief walk to clear her head. Instead, her feet carried her toward the edge of town, past the church and the schoolhouse, until she found herself on the road leading out of Cherry Creek. "Miss Oakley." The voice startled her from her troubled thoughts. She looked up to find Brayden approaching on horseback, apparently returning from one of his delivery routes. "Mr. Zeller," she acknowledged, hastily wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Brayden dismounted immediately, concern evident in his expression. What's happened? Are you ill? The genuine worry in his voice broke something in Florence. The careful facade she had maintained since arriving in Cherry Creek crumbled, and the truth spilled out before she could stop it. "I'm with child," she blurted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Sullivan has asked me to leave the boarding house by Saturday, and I have nowhere to go." She expected shock, disappointment, perhaps even disgust. Instead, Brayden's expression remained steady, his eyes holding hers without judgment. "I see," he said simply. "And the father, gone," Florence replied bitterly. "He vanished the moment I told him. My parents disowned me. That's why I came west, not because they died, but because they cast me out." Brayden absorbed this information in silence. Florence waited for him to make his excuses, to retreat from her disgrace. No respectable man would want association with a fallen woman carrying another man's child. What he said next stunned her completely. "Marry me." Florence stared at him in disbelief. "What? Marry me?" Brayden repeated, his voice steady and sure. "I have a home, land, means to support a family. You need protection, security for yourself and your child." "But the child isn't yours," Florence stammered. "You would take responsibility for another man's. A child needs a father," Brayden interrupted. "And you need a husband. I'm offering both." Florence shook her head, unable to comprehend his proposal. "You can't want this." "The scandal, the gossip. Let them talk," Brayden said dismissively. "People will speculate no matter what we do. If we marry quickly, most will simply assume the child is mine, and that propriety demanded immediate action." "But why?" Florence asked, still bewildered by his offer. "Why would you do this?" Brayden's expression softened. "Because in the weeks I've known you, I've come to care for you more than I expected. Because I've been alone too long and you've shown me what I've been missing. Because everyone deserves a second chance." He paused, then added simply, "Because I want to." Florence felt tears welling in her eyes again, but these were different from the desperate ones she had shed earlier. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Brayden urged gently. "We'll build our own family here, the three of us." "Say yes, Florence." The use of her given name, spoken with such tenderness, broke the last of her resistance. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I'll marry you." The relief that washed over Brayden's face told Florence that his offer had not been made lightly or without personal investment. He truly wanted this, wanted her, despite everything. "We'll speak to Reverend Hayes today," Brayden decided, practical as always. "He can marry us tomorrow, and you can move to the homestead immediately afterward. No need to spend another night at the boarding house if you don't wish to." Events moved with breathtaking speed after that moment on the road. Reverend Hayes, though initially surprised by the urgency of their request, agreed to perform the ceremony the following afternoon. Mrs. Sullivan, informed of Florence's impending marriage, maintained a skeptical expression but offered stilted congratulations. Word spread quickly through the small town. Florence endured curious stares and whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when she approached. Some clients canceled their appointments at the Mercantile, while others made a point of expressing support for her hasty but romantic marriage. Through it all, Brayden remained steadfast. He arranged for a wagon to transport Florence's belongings to his homestead, spoke with Mr. McPherson about the possibility of Florence continuing her work from home, and even purchased a simple gold band from the jeweler at the far end of town. The wedding itself was a modest affair. Florence wore her best blue dress, now altered to accommodate her expanding waistline. Brayden dressed in a clean shirt and his least worn trousers. The only witnesses were the McPhersons and, surprisingly, Mrs. Billings from the boarding house, who declared she never missed a wedding if she could help it. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. As Florence repeated the traditional vows, she felt a strange sense of rightness despite the unconventional circumstances. When Brayden slipped the gold band onto her finger and Reverend Hayes pronounced them husband and wife, she experienced not the shame she had feared but a profound gratitude. "Mrs. Zeller," Brayden said quietly as they exited the church, testing the sound of her new name. "Ready to see your home." The journey to Brayden's homestead took less than an hour. As they crested a small rise, Florence got her first glimpse of the property that was now her home. The cabin was larger than she had imagined, a solid structure built of logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch across the front. A barn stood nearby, along with corrals for the horses and a chicken coop. Behind the house, a vegetable garden lay dormant for the winter, and a small orchard of young fruit trees lined one side of the property. A creek, not Cherry Creek itself, but a smaller tributary, wound through the western edge of the land. "It's beautiful," Florence murmured, genuinely impressed by what Brayden had accomplished on his own. "It's not fancy," Brayden replied, helping her down from the wagon. "But it's solid, and there's room to grow." The interior of the cabin revealed the same practical competence that characterized everything Brayden did. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs, and basic cooking equipment. A doorway led to a small bedroom containing a bed frame with a straw-filled mattress and a chest for clothing. "I'll build another room," Brayden promised, noting her assessment of the space. "For the baby, and perhaps more children someday if that's something you might want." The tentative hope in his voice touched Florence deeply. This man, who had taken on responsibility for her and her unborn child without hesitation, was already thinking of a future together, a real family, not merely an arrangement of convenience. "I would like that," she admitted softly. "Someday." Their first evening as husband and wife was marked by a careful courtesy, as they navigated the unfamiliar territory of shared domestic life. Brayden insisted on preparing supper, demonstrating surprising competence with the simple meal of beans, bacon, and biscuits. Florence found herself watching his movements around the cabin, the confidence of a man accustomed to caring for himself, yet the underlying gentleness that had drawn her to him from the beginning. When it came time to retire for the night, Brayden cleared his throat awkwardly. "I can sleep by the fire," he offered, "until you're comfortable with other arrangements." Florence appreciated his consideration but understood that their marriage, however unconventional its beginning, needed to be real in all aspects if it was to succeed. "We're husband and wife," she said quietly. "There's no need for you to sleep on the floor in your own home." That night, they shared the bed with a careful space maintained between them. Florence lay awake long after Brayden's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep, marveling at the turn her life had taken. A month ago, she had been destitute and desperate, cast out by her family and facing a bleak future as an unwed mother. Now she was married to a good man, secure in a home of her own, with prospects for continuing her work and raising her child in safety. The child chose that moment to make its presence known with a flutter of movement. Florence placed her hand over the spot, a smile forming on her lips. "We'll be all right," she whispered to her unborn baby. "We found our place." As if in response to her words, Brayden shifted in his sleep, his arm unconsciously reaching across the space between them to rest protectively over her abdomen. Florence closed her eyes, allowing herself to believe, for the first time since discovering her pregnancy, that happiness might still be possible. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment for both of them. Florence learned the rhythms of life on the homestead, caring for the chickens, tending the fire, preparing meals from the stores Brayden had laid in for winter. Brayden adapted to sharing his space, to consulting another person on decisions both large and small, to the simple pleasure of conversation over supper each evening. With Brayden's help, Florence established a workroom in a corner of the main living area. Clients who truly valued her skills made the journey from town for fittings and consultations, though some still refused to patronize a woman whose hasty marriage clearly indicated impropriety. The loss of income was concerning but not devastating, as Brayden's freight business provided steady support. As December arrived, bringing colder weather and occasional snow, Florence's pregnancy became impossible to disguise. Her body changed rapidly, her abdomen rounding prominently beneath her altered dresses. Brayden watched these changes with a curious mixture of respect and wonder, sometimes catching himself staring when he thought she wouldn't notice. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Florence working on a christening gown commissioned by Mrs. McPherson for her newest grandchild, Brayden broached a subject they had thus far avoided. "Have you thought about names?" he asked, nodding toward her rounded belly. "For the baby." Florence set aside her sewing, surprised by the question. They had discussed practical preparations, the cradle Brayden was building, the tiny garments Florence was sewing, but not this more personal aspect of the child's identity. "I hadn't gotten that far," she admitted. "Everything happened so quickly, and then there was the wedding and the move." Brayden nodded, understanding. "My mother's name was Elizabeth," he offered tentatively, "if it's a girl, and my father was Samuel." The gesture moved Florence profoundly, that he would offer his own family names for a child not of his blood. "They're beautiful names," she said softly. "My mother is Margaret and my father is John." She hesitated, then added, "Though I don't know if I have the right to use their names, given how things ended between us." Brayden considered this. "Perhaps the child is a chance for new beginnings," he suggested. "A bridge between past and future." The wisdom in his words struck Florence deeply. "Elizabeth Margaret for a girl," she decided. "Samuel John for a boy." Brayden's smile was warm with approval. "Perfect," he agreed. As Christmas approached, Brayden made more frequent trips to town for supplies and to complete deliveries before the worst of winter weather made travel difficult. On one such trip in mid-December, he returned with an unexpected bounty, a small pine tree lashed to the back of his wagon, along with packages wrapped in brown paper. "What's all this?" Florence asked, watching in amusement as he struggled to bring the tree through the door. "Christmas," Brayden replied simply. "Thought we should celebrate our first one properly." Together, they set up the tree in a corner of the main room. Brayden produced a box of ornaments, simple wooden figures and glass balls that had been carefully stored away. "These were my mother's," he explained as Florence unwrapped a delicate glass star. "Haven't had occasion to use them since I came west." The revelation that he had carried these precious mementos of his family across the country, preserving them through years of solitary life, touched Florence deeply. This was not merely a man fulfilling an obligation or honoring a hasty promise. This was a man building a life, creating a home, embracing the family he had chosen. On Christmas Eve, Florence presented Brayden with a gift she had been working on secretly, a new shirt made from fabric she had asked Mrs. McPherson to set aside from the mercantile stock. She had sewn it during the hours when Brayden was outside tending to the livestock or working in the barn. "It's not much," she said apologetically as he unwrapped the package. Brayden held up the garment, his expression one of genuine appreciation. "It's perfect," he assured her, running his fingers over the precise stitching. "No one's made anything for me since my mother died." In return, he gave her a rocking chair he had purchased from the furniture maker in town. "For when the baby comes," he explained as he positioned it near the fireplace. "You'll need somewhere comfortable to sit during those long nights." Florence sank into the chair, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to express the full measure of her gratitude not just for the chair, but for everything he had given her. A home, security, respectability, and most precious of all, acceptance. That night, as they lay beside each other in the darkness, the space between them seemed to diminish. Florence found herself reaching for Brayden's hand, needing the connection, the reassurance of his presence. "Are you happy?" she asked quietly. "With this? With us?" Brayden's fingers tightened around hers. "Happier than I've been in years," he replied without hesitation. "Maybe happier than I've ever been." The simple honesty of his answer broke something open in Florence's heart. She turned toward him, closing the careful distance they had maintained since their wedding night. Brayden's arms encircled her, mindful of her pregnant belly between them. "I never expected to find this," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I left Kansas, I thought my life was over. I never imagined I might find love." The word hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Brayden's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I love you, Florence," he said, the words simple but profound in the darkness. "Not out of pity or obligation. I love who you are, your courage, your determination, your kindness." "And I love you," she replied, the truth of it washing through her with startling clarity. What had begun as an arrangement of necessity had transformed into something genuine and deep. "I love you, Brayden Zeller." When he kissed her, it was gentle and reverent, a promise rather than a demand. Florence responded with the growing certainty that this man, this good, honorable man, was truly her husband in every sense that mattered. January brought heavy snow that isolated the homestead for days at a time. Brayden worked tirelessly to keep paths clear to the barn and chicken coop, to ensure their firewood remained dry and plentiful, and to check on their nearest neighbors, a ranching family a mile to the east. Florence's pregnancy advanced rapidly. Her back ached constantly, her ankles swelled, and the baby's movements grew stronger and more frequent. Brayden watched these developments with increasing concern, aware that the time for childbirth was approaching and worried about her isolation from medical care. "Perhaps you should stay in town until the baby comes," he suggested one evening as he massaged her aching feet. "Mrs. McPherson would take you in, and Dr. Wilson would be close at hand if needed." Florence shook her head firmly. "I want our child born at home," she insisted. "Mrs. Jensen from the ranch has delivered dozens of babies. She's already agreed to come when my time arrives." Brayden didn't look entirely convinced, but he respected her decision. He redoubled his efforts to prepare for the birth, ensuring they had clean linens, boiled water stored in crocks, and supplies of the herbs Mrs. Jensen had recommended. The baby arrived on a clear, cold February morning. Florence woke at dawn with a sharp pain that took her breath away. She reached for Brayden, who was instantly alert at her gasp of discomfort. "Is it time?" he asked, his voice steady despite the worry in his eyes. Florence nodded, unable to speak as another contraction gripped her. Brayden sprang into action, helping her to a sitting position and pulling on his clothes. "I'll fetch Mrs. Jensen," he promised, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Can you manage until I return?" "Yes," Florence assured him between breaths. "But hurry." The hours that followed tested Florence's endurance beyond anything she had previously experienced. Mrs. Jensen arrived promptly, her calm efficiency a balm to both Florence's pain and Brayden's anxiety. She examined Florence quickly and announced that the baby was properly positioned, but that labor would likely continue for some time. "First babies take their time," she explained matter-of-factly. "Might be evening before we see this little one." Mrs. Jensen was right. The sun climbed high in the sky and began its descent as Florence labored, walking the small confines of the cabin when possible, resting in the intervals between increasingly intense contractions. Brayden remained nearby, bringing water, supporting her weight during the worst pains and following Mrs. Jensen's instructions without question. As dusk approached, the contractions intensified dramatically. Florence found herself clinging to Brayden's hand with bruising force as her body worked to bring their child into the world. "You can do this," he murmured against her temple, his voice steady despite his obvious concern. "You're the strongest person I know, Florence. Just a little longer, Mrs." Jensen positioned herself at the foot of the bed. "It's time to push, Mrs. Zeller," she instructed. "Your baby's ready to meet you." With Brayden supporting her back and gripping her hands, Florence gathered her remaining strength. The pain was blinding, all-encompassing, but beneath it was a fierce determination to bring her child safely into the world. 3 mighty efforts later, the cabin filled with the indignant cry of a newborn. Mrs. Jensen's face broke into a broad smile as she lifted the squirming, red-faced infant. "You have a son," she announced, placing the tiny boy on Florence's chest. "A fine, healthy boy." Florence gazed down at her child through a haze of exhaustion and joy. He was perfect tiny fingers, a shock of dark hair, and a fierce scowl that softened as he nestled against her warmth. Beside her, Brayden made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Samuel John Zeller," Florence whispered, looking up at her husband. "If you still want—" "Yes," Brayden interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "Samuel John Zeller, our son. Our son." The simple words carried profound meaning. This child, conceived in circumstances of deceit and abandonment, would grow up claimed and wanted with a father who had chosen him, who already loved him sight unseen. Mrs. Jensen efficiently completed her duties delivering the afterbirth, checking Florence for excessive bleeding, and helping her to clean up and change into a fresh nightgown. Throughout it all, Brayden cradled Samuel against his chest, speaking softly to the newborn and counting tiny fingers and toes with wonder. When Mrs. Jensen finally departed, promising to return the following day to check on mother and child, Florence and Brayden were left alone with their son. The 3 of them huddled together on the bed, a new family created not by blood but by choice and commitment. "Thank you," Florence murmured as Samuel nursed at her breast, his tiny hand flexing against her skin. "For everything. For giving him your name, your home, your protection." Brayden stroked a gentle finger over Samuel's dark hair. "He's mine in every way that matters," he replied simply. "From this day forward, he's my son." The weeks following Samuel's birth were a blur of exhaustion, joy, and adjustment. The baby thrived under his parents' devoted care, growing steadily and developing a distinct personality, alert, determined, and quick to smile. Florence recovered her strength gradually, returning to her sewing work when Samuel was a month old, taking commissions she could complete at home while the baby napped. Brayden proved to be a natural father, as competent with infant care as he was with every other practical task. He thought nothing of changing soiled diapers, walking the floor with a fussy baby, or adjusting his work schedule to allow Florence time to rest. His obvious devotion to Samuel touched Florence deeply, reinforcing her growing love for the man who had saved her from disgrace and given her child a name. Spring brought renewal to the homestead. The vegetable garden was prepared and planted, the fruit trees blossomed, and Brayden began construction on the promised addition to the cabin, a small room for Samuel and any future children they might have. Florence watched these preparations with a sense of permanence she had never expected to feel again after being cast out by her family. Cherry Creek was her home now, this small homestead the center of her world, and the man who worked tirelessly to improve it the foundation of her security and happiness. One warm evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset with 3-month-old Samuel sleeping in Florence's arms, Brayden brought up a subject they had not discussed since their wedding. "I received a letter from the land office in Denver," he began, his tone carefully casual. "There's a parcel adjacent to our property available for homesteading, another 160 acres. Good water, timber for building, land that could be cleared for crops or pasture." Florence raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking of claiming it?" Brayden nodded. "If we're going to build something lasting, we'll need more land, especially if—" He hesitated, then continued, "especially if our family continues to grow." The implication was clear. Though their marriage had been consummated in the months since Samuel's birth, they had not explicitly discussed having more children. Brayden was offering her a vision of their future, not merely as a convenient arrangement born of necessity, but as a true partnership with the possibility of additional children, their own biological offspring to join the son they already shared. "I would like that," Florence said softly, meeting his gaze directly. "To build something lasting, together." The smile that spread across Brayden's face confirmed that her answer pleased him deeply. He reached over to take her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers in a gesture that had become familiar and precious. "Then it's settled," he said. "I'll file the claim when I go to Denver next week." As darkness fell around them, Florence reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the span of 7 months. From despair and rejection to love and acceptance, from shame to pride, from isolation to family. The journey had not been easy, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead, but she faced the future now with confidence rather than fear. Samuel stirred against her chest, his tiny face scrunching briefly before relaxing back into sleep. Florence bent to press a kiss to his forehead, inhaling the sweet scent of her son. Beside her, Brayden's solid presence offered security and companionship she had once thought forever beyond her reach. "We should get him inside," Brayden suggested as the evening air grew cooler. "It's getting late." Florence nodded, allowing Brayden to help her to her feet. As they entered the cabin, their home, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the man who had found her at her lowest moment and offered not judgment but acceptance, not condemnation but compassion. "I love you," she said simply as he took Samuel from her arms to place him in the cradle he had crafted with his own hands. Brayden's expression softened as he looked up at her. "And I love you," he replied. "Both of you, my family." In those words, Florence found the perfect encapsulation of their journey from strangers to spouses to true partners united by love rather than mere necessity. Against all odds, she had found not just shelter but a home, not just security but happiness, not just a protector but a lover and friend. As they prepared for bed that night, Florence thought of her parents far away in Kansas, of the family that had rejected her in her time of greatest need. Perhaps someday, when the wound was less raw, she would write to them, tell them of her husband and son, of the life she had built from the ashes of their rejection. Perhaps not. Either way, she was no longer defined by their abandonment. Here in Cherry Creek, in this small cabin with the man who had claimed her and her child as his own, Florence Zeller had found her true family, one built not on blood ties and social conventions but on choice, commitment, and love. It was, she reflected as she drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, the most precious gift she had ever received. Samuel John Zeller grew into a healthy, robust child with his mother's dark hair and his father's steady temperament. By his first birthday, he was taking tentative steps across the cabin floor, reaching always for Brayden with absolute trust and confidence in his father's waiting arms. The additional land Brayden had claimed was gradually developed, fences built, fields cleared, plans laid for eventual expansion of their livestock beyond the few chickens, milk cow, and horses they currently possessed. The freight business continued to thrive as Cherry Creek grew, providing steady income that allowed them to improve the homestead with each passing season. In the summer after Samuel's first birthday, Florence discovered she was expecting again. The news brought joy to both her and Brayden, though this pregnancy carried none of the shame and anxiety that had marked her first. This child would be born into an established family, to parents united in marriage and purpose. Elizabeth Margaret Zeller arrived in the early spring of 1879, a tiny, fair-haired daughter who captured her father's heart from her first breath. Brayden, who had been a devoted father to Samuel from the moment of his birth, seemed particularly enchanted by his daughter, carrying her proudly whenever he went to town and speaking of her remarkable beauty and intelligence to anyone who would listen. As the years passed, the Zeller family continued to grow and prosper. 2 more children joined the family, another son, Michael, born in 1881, and a second daughter, Grace, in 1883. The original cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Brayden adding rooms as needed, until it became a proper house with separate bedrooms for the children, a spacious kitchen, and even a dedicated sewing room where Florence continued to work on commissions from town. Samuel grew into his role as eldest brother with seriousness and responsibility that mirrored Brayden's approach to life. By the time he was 10, he was helping with meaningful work around the homestead, feeding livestock, assisting with planting and harvest, and learning the freight business at his father's side. Though he knew the truth of his birth, Florence and Brayden had agreed to tell him when he was old enough to understand. He never showed any sign of feeling less connected to Brayden than his siblings were. In every way that mattered, Brayden was his father, and the bond between them was unshakable. Florence maintained connections to the community in Cherry Creek, though the focus of her life remained the homestead and her family. Her sewing business continued to thrive, with clients willing to travel the few miles to their home for her skilled work. As her children grew, she taught them all her craft, sons as well as daughters, believing in the value of practical skills, regardless of gender. The town itself evolved from a rough mining settlement to a more established community with a proper school, additional churches, and businesses that served families rather than just single miners and drifters. The Zellers were respected members of this growing community, their unusual beginning long forgotten or deliberately overlooked in light of the exemplary family they had become. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Brayden surprised Florence with a gold locket containing tiny portraits of their 4 children, commissioned from a traveling photographer who had visited Cherry Creek the previous summer. The gift brought tears to Florence's eyes, not just for its beauty, but for the journey it represented, from the desperate young woman on a muddy Kansas road to the contented wife and mother she had become. "Did you ever regret it?" she asked Brayden that night as they sat alone on the porch, the children asleep inside. "Marrying me under those circumstances?" Brayden considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "Not for a single day," he replied finally. "Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, Florence. Everything good in my life came from that moment on the road when you told me the truth." Florence leaned against his shoulder, the solid strength that had supported her through births and illnesses, joys and sorrows, triumphs, and challenges. Who would have thought that being cast out by my family would lead me to build a better one? She mused. Brayden's arm tightened around her shoulders. That's what we did, isn't it? We built our own family here, and it's a good one. Florence nodded, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson over the land they had cultivated together. The best, she agreed softly. The very best. In the distance, she could hear the faint sounds of Cherry Creek going about its evening business. Somewhere in Kansas, her parents continued their lives without her, never knowing the grandchildren who carried their names, never seeing the woman their daughter had become. Florence felt a momentary sadness for what they had chosen to lose, but it was fleeting, overwhelmed by gratitude for what she had found. Here, on this homestead with this man and their children, Florence Oakley Zeller had discovered the true meaning of family, not a matter of blood or social conventions, but of love freely given and received, of commitment honored through hardship and joy, of a bond stronger than shame or scandal or societal expectations. She had been pregnant and banished by her family until a cowboy said, "We'll build our own family here." And they had done exactly that.